Republicans are lining up for a chance to take on Steven Horsford in Congressional District 4, and we're talking with a successful businesswoman who recently announced her candidacy. Welcome to Nevada Politics Today. I'm your host, Victor Jakes. Lisa Song Sutton is an entrepreneur and business owner who is also Miss Nevada United States in 2014. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as you know, over the weekend there were two tragic mass shootings, and the calls for gun control in Congress have grown louder and louder. Does Congress need to pass any new gun legislation?
It's an awful situation, and unfortunately it's one that we've seen kind of rear its ugly head in more recent times. The Second Amendment is something that's been around since the inception of our country, and as a result, U.S. citizens have always had access to firearms. I think it's very important to note that more restrictive gun laws ultimately end up hurting U.S. citizens, law-abiding citizens who are gun owners. Things need to change. Something has to be done, and it's a multi-pronged approach. I think one of the main issues is mental health. And for as much as the American society talks about mental health, we have to really pay attention to the fact that we aren't doing enough in relation to providing services, making sure that there are mental health professionals available, especially in schools, right? There are thousands of schools that don't have a psychologist on staff, and yet they have a police officer on staff. So where are we putting our resources? Where are we putting our time and energy? The Parkland shooting is a great example where the perpetrator, he was already identified. His mother called the police. He was already identified, and yet there was no opportunity for that to be taken seriously, treated, and then hopefully, dealt with in a positive manner.
So Republicans have expressed interest in doing what's called a red flag law, where when someone sees someone who they think has, potential to be violent, a court could take away their weapons for a period of time. Is that something you would support?
There must be due process in something like that. I think it's very important to point out that just because someone may have a mental health issue does not mean that they're a harm to themselves or others necessarily. There must be due process. There has to be a mechanism in place where before the weapons are taken away, they need to be adjudicated in front of a judge, and then let the judge decide if that person may be stripped of their Second Amendment rights and have their guns taken away from them.
A couple of weeks ago, Congress and the President passed a budget-busting budget deal that expanded the deficit. If you were in Congress, would you have voted for that?
I think it's really important to realize that our out-of-control budget ultimately just ends up mortgaging our future, right? Future generations are the ones that are going to have to deal with this giant balloon that we're creating. So ultimately, yes, if we need to be expending more resources, then we need to see where we can take action in providing cuts, where we can reduce spending in other areas in order to spend more.
Would you be open to any reforms in Social Security or Medicare? I mean, those are the two big drivers of budget deficits.
With Social Security, I think it's really important for people to remember that this is a significant portion of income for senior citizens. This is something that allows retirement for the American people. So for people to have more taken out of their paycheck to go towards Social Security, that's something that's important, but we also have to realize and make sure that gets carved away actually to be used for Social Security and not just in one giant bucket where hopefully there'll be some left to be put towards Social Security.
Tied in with the budget is the tax issue. A lot of Republicans will sign what's called the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, pledging not to raise taxes. Is that something you would sign?
Absolutely. I don't believe in raising taxes in order to just provide more for these buckets of potentially wasteful spending. I think we have to be very mindful of the funds that are being taxed upon and being paid for by the American taxpayer and where that money goes and how it's spent.
A more local issue is Yucca Mountain. CD4 is home to Yucca Mountain. Nevada politicians have, historically almost unanimously opposed storing nuclear waste at Yucca. What should be done with Yucca Mountain?
I strongly encourage and believe in a consent-based approach. Ultimately, I think the people of Nevada have to be educated around what does that mean for nuclear waste to be stored here? What are the consequences of that? What does that mean for it to be trucked through and transported through the area? And then let the people decide and let them voice whether it's something they're okay with or not.
So what would that look like? It sounds like you aren't just opposed to it just on principle. Would it be something where a ballot referendum or the legislature approves? What would that look like?
I think there's a myriad of potential benefits that are there. I know I've heard some talk around recycling and finding ways to reuse it. If that were to be something that becomes legal in the United States, I understand that there's technology for it in Europe, and that's currently being done in areas of Europe. If there was a chance for that to be done here, I think that option has to be truly fleshed out, and to figure out, okay, well, what does that mean for the people of Nevada? Does that mean that, like Alaska, the people of Nevada get some sort of incentive? Is there a dollar amount tied to bringing it here and storing it here, and trucking it through, our neighborhoods and on the 215? I think more education and more conversation has to be made in order to really advocate this consent-based approach, where people have an educated stance on it and then they can decide.
I want to turn to healthcare. The Democrat presidential candidates are either endorsing Medicare for all, or at least allowing the public to buy into Medicare as an option. Would you support either of those proposals?
I think people are always entitled to options. I believe in a free market, right? Absolutely. So people absolutely should be entitled to options. I think absolutely something needs to be done with the way that the current healthcare system is set up, because I just know as an employer, the cost for us to pay for healthcare premiums for our employees the monthly premium has doubled, and it's
since when?
Since 2011.
So
just
under Obamacare.
In looking at our rates from 2011
Right.
to now. Literally, the monthly premium has doubled, and yet the coverage is actually less. It's like not as good coverage as we had in 2011, and people are upset about that, and I know what that's like to have to pay that out and tell your staff, I'm sorry, this is the only options we have right now. So I would encourage truly free market where there's more competition, right? Hopefully more competition will drive down the price.
So, with that getting rid of things like the requirement that the insurance companies insure people with pre-existing conditions, one of the reasons insurance has gotten expensive is that if someone is very sick, they can come in at the same rate as someone who's very healthy.
I support pre-existing conditions because ultimately here in the United States, everyone has different circumstances, right? But I think it's important to put choice back onto employers and people who want to pay for private insurance if they choose to, and give them a myriad of choices so that they can decide what's going to be best for them and their families.
Earlier this year, Democrats passed a $15 an hour minimum wage through the House of Representatives. Is that something you would support?
No, because as a small business owner, I just know that that's crippling to small business. For us as small businesses, we pay higher than the minimum wage, and that's because, one, of course, we believe in a living wage, but two, we want to attract and retain top talent, right? So we're going to do everything that we can to make sure that our staff is well taken care of to the best of our ability.
Should there be a federal minimum wage?
I believe in limited government, right? So I would hope that business owners, especially small business owners, are in tune with what their staff needs, and they are able to make the decisions that work with everyone in listening to their staff and what their staff needs of what the right wage is going to be. I think Bernie Sanders is a perfect example of how $15 an hour doesn't work, right? Like, you can pay your staff $15 an hour, and then guess what? He's cutting hours. So you look at like the mom and pop sandwich shop that I go to often in North Las Vegas. It's literally the wife does the cooking, the husband is the cashier, and I think I've been in there where it's a crowded lunchtime and they have two kind of staff / busboys. You can't tell me at $8 a sandwich, and that's like all in, that's like with chips and a drink, right? At $8 a meal that they can afford to pay $15 an hour to their employees. It's just not possible.
I'll ask you about another bill that passed passed the House recently called the Equality Act. And what it would do is it would extend non-discrimination provisions to people with gender identity. So this would require businesses or schools to allow men who identify as women to use the female restroom, for instance. Is that something you would support?
I completely understand the small business owner's right to be able to refuse service to any customer. However, I don't think that it's right for them to refuse service based on race, religion, or sexual orientation.
So this isn't necessarily even refusing service. This is saying that schools would have to allow biological men to use the female restroom if they identify as women.
We live in a really interesting time, right? And ultimately, I know very few Republicans supported that act, and I think what I would want to point out to the Republicans that didn't support it is that we live in a modern time, right? We live in a modern time where the U.S. citizen, the regular U.S. citizen, isn't just one color or one religion or even one sexual orientation. Ultimately, we live in a modern time, and our laws should be reflective of that.
So you would support it?
I would.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Remember, if it involves Nevada politics, we're talking about it right here on Nevada Politics Today. We're off for the next couple weeks, so I'll see you soon.